She had been invisible her entire life. Not the tragic, poetic kind of invisible that poets write about with a glass of wine in hand. The kind that hurts. The kind where your own mother scans a room looking for you and somehow her gaze lands on everyone else first. The kind where your name is the last one called at supper. Where your chair is pushed slightly back from the table so that you don't quite belong to the circle. Where your sister's laughter fills every room and yours dissolves into the wallpaper before anyone hears it. Willow Marsh had lived 23 years in the comfortable, suffocating shadow of her family's indifference. And then, on one impossible evening in the spring of 1807, in the blazing chandelier light of Lady Ashworth's annual ball, with 300 of London's finest watching, the most dangerous, most notorious, most determinedly unmarried man in all of England dropped to one knee before her and kissed her hand. The room went silent, and Willow's life changed forever. If you've ever felt like the one nobody notices, this story is for you. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me who you'd want to kneel at your feet. Let's get into it. The year was 1807, and London's season had opened with its usual fanfare, new gowns, old scandals, and the relentless machinery of matrimonial ambition grinding forward without mercy or sentiment. The Marsh family had arrived from their estate in Wiltshire with three primary purposes: to find a suitable match for Arabella, the eldest daughter, to remind society of their continued relevance despite a string of quiet financial misfortunes, and, almost incidentally, to bring Willow along so that she might benefit from the social air, as their mother, Mrs. Cecily Marsh, put it, as though London were a spa town and not a battlefield. Willow was 23, Arabella was 25, and the pressure of two failed seasons hung over the family like weather, but one would not have known it from watching Arabella move through a room. She had learned long ago to wear urgency the way other women wore pearls, close to the throat, hidden under the right angle of the chin. Arabella Marsh was, by every conventional measure, stunning. She had the kind of beauty that society catalogues with ease: fair-haired, bright-eyed, quick-smiling. She knew how to enter a room on a beat, hesitate at the threshold just long enough for heads to turn, then proceed with the precise confidence of a woman who has practiced in mirrors and never admitted it. She was charming in the way that can be weaponized, and she had, over 25 years, become very skilled at the weapon. Willow was different. She was not plain, though her family had managed to make her feel that she was, through years of comparative remarks delivered with the warmth of people who genuinely believed themselves to be helpful. Arabella has your mother's cheekbones. Of course. You have your father's steadiness. Steadiness. As though she were a table. As though the goal of a woman's face was furniture-like utility. In truth, Willow had a quality that resisted the easy language of the season. She was the kind of beautiful that required attention. Her features were not arranged for first impressions. They were arranged for the second look, and the third, for the person willing to stay in a conversation long enough to notice that her expressions moved like weather across a landscape, that her laugh arrived slowly and then all at once, that her eyes, when she was genuinely moved, said everything her mouth was too careful to speak. No one in her family had ever been that person, and so no one in her family had ever really seen her. She spent the first weeks of the season doing what she always did at social events, observing. She stood near walls, near windows, near doorways, liminal spaces, thresholds, places that belonged to the architecture rather than the party. She listened to conversations she was not included in and filed away the information with the quiet efficiency of someone who has had to understand people from a distance because being close was rarely offered. She read voraciously, which her mother considered a character flaw. She had opinions about poetry, which Arabella found bewildering and slightly threatening in the way that things we don't understand always are. She had a habit of going still in the middle of a crowded room, not from shyness exactly, but from something more like wonder, the sense that if she held her breath, she might catch the world being honest for just a moment. No one courted her. A few gentlemen had tried over the years. There had been Mr. Fenton in the autumn of 1805, kind, a little dull, with a modest property in Kent and excellent posture. They had taken 3 walks together before Arabella, who was bored and between admirers, had directed her full attention at him for the span of one dinner party. Mr. Fenton had written Willow a letter afterwards that was so apologetic it was almost worse than silence. There had been young Lord Caldwell the following year, who was genuinely interested until his mother met the Marsh family's finances. And there had been a handful of dances and one almost conversation in a library that Willow still thought about sometimes when she was being unkind to herself. She had stopped expecting to be chosen. She had not, however, stopped hoping, and that small, persistent hope was the most painful thing about her, and also the most beautiful, though she did not know that yet. The night of Lady Ashworth's ball fell on the 14th of April, and London was doing that particular early spring thing where the air can't decide between winter and warmth and ends up being both at once, cold enough that the ladies kept their wraps until the last possible moment, warm enough that the candles inside made every room feel like an embrace. Lady Ashworth's house was one of those Mayfair institutions that existed as much as a stage as a home. The ceilings were absurdly high. The chandeliers were absurdly numerous. The guest list was assembled with the precision of a military campaign, and invitations were calibrated to convey exactly the right amount of social approval, coveted enough to be meaningful, broad enough that the room would be satisfyingly full. The Marsh family arrived at 9 in the evening, which was Mrs. Marsh had decided the optimal time, late enough to suggest they had other options, early enough that Arabella would have the full field of eligible men to survey before the dancing began. They moved through the receiving line with practiced ease. Mrs. Marsh ahead, working the room. Arabella beside her, a constellation unto herself. Willow behind, slightly, always slightly, in a dress that was perfectly acceptable, a pale gold that suited her colouring, though her mother had called it very sensible when she'd seen it, which was not a compliment. Willow didn't mind the dress. She thought the colour was like late afternoon light, and that had been enough. She found her way, within 20 minutes, to a position near the tall windows at the east side of the ballroom, where she could watch the dancers and hold a glass of lemonade and not be required to perform happiness she wasn't feeling. It was a good wall. She had learned to identify good walls the way a sailor reads weather. The evening unfolded in the usual ways. Music, introductions, the stiff architecture of social conversation where everyone says the expected thing and means something else entirely. Arabella collected admirers like she was being paid for it, laughing at the right moments, touching her fan to her chin, looking up through her lashes with a precision that Willow had watched her practice since childhood. And then he arrived. Alaric Pendergast, the Duke of Pendergast, was 30 years old in the spring of 1807 and had been, since his father's death in 1801, when he was just 24, the subject of more maternal scheming, more whispered ambition, and more elaborate social strategy than perhaps any man in England. He was a duke. He was young. He was, by all accounts that mattered to London society, eligible, even if he had made something of a sport of being anything but. His reputation was not precisely scandalous. It was more like a long, leisurely refusal. He attended the right events, wore the right clothes, moved through the right rooms. And then, when some mother with a daughter and a plan thought she had him cornered, he smiled with a pleasantness that contained no warmth whatsoever and extricated himself with the ease of a man who has had considerable practice. He had no interest in marriage, or so he said. He said it pleasantly. He said it consistently. He said it in the drawing rooms of half of London, and half of London chose not to believe him, because a duke must marry eventually, and optimism is the engine of the season. What people did not know about Alaric, what was not visible in the pleasantness of his refusals, or the easy confidence with which he navigated every room, was the thing underneath, the thing he kept under layers of charm and deliberate distance, under the libertine reputation he had half cultivated because it was easier than the truth. The truth was that Alaric had spent 6 years watching what marriage looked like from the inside of one that had curdled. His parents had been a society match, arranged with efficiency, executed with surface-level courtesy, and quietly devastating to observe. His father had been cold in the way that some men are cold, not cruel exactly, but absent in ways that carved more damage than cruelty sometimes did. His mother had endured, had been gracious, had done everything right, and had been lonelier than anyone around her seemed to notice or care about. He had noticed. He had been 12 when he first understood what he was seeing. He had been 24 when he buried his father and looked at his inheritance and felt, underneath the grief that was complicated and strange, a relief he did not know what to do with, followed immediately by the understanding that he had no model for what a different kind of life could look like. He did not want what his parents had had. He also did not know what he wanted instead. So he had spent 6 years enjoying himself in the ways that were available to a wealthy, titled, charming young man, and keeping everyone at exactly the distance required to prevent wanting anything more. It was working fine. Until the 14th of April, 1807. He had come to Lady Ashworth's ball because it was expected, and because Lord Hailey had promised him the card room would be well stocked, and because he had been to 4 events in the previous week and attending a 5th, made him feel like a participating member of civilized society rather than a man in open flight from it. He was standing near the card room entrance, engaged in a conversation about horses with 2 men whose names he would not remember by morning when he heard it. Not loudly. That was the thing. It was said at the pitch and cadence of something meant to be private, which meant it was meant to be overheard by exactly the right people, and not by the wrong ones. Arabella Marsh was standing with 2 other young women near the edge of the dance floor, fan moving with the leisured confidence of a woman who knows she's being watched. The 3 of them were looking at someone, and what Arabella said, with a little laugh threaded through it like a knife through silk, was this: "Poor Willow. She does try, doesn't she? 3 seasons and not a single serious offer. I don't know why Mother keeps bringing her. Nobody wants you when there's a better option standing right next to you." The 2 companions laughed, one genuinely, one nervously, and Arabella moved her fan and said nothing else, because she didn't need to. The damage was done in 11 words. Alaric had heard it because he had good hearing, and because the room had done one of those odd musical pauses in that exact moment, the pause between one song ending and another beginning, when human conversation suddenly sounds louder than anyone intended. He turned. He saw the woman they were talking about before he'd fully processed the decision to look. She was standing near the east windows with a glass of lemonade and an expression that Alaric recognized with a force that surprised him. The expression of someone absorbing a blow they were expecting and have learned to absorb quietly, not crumpling, not crying, just going very still in the particular way that people go still when they are fighting to keep something inside. She had heard. Of course, she had heard. He watched her for the space of 2 heartbeats, watched her chin lift, infinitesimally, watched her press her lips together and look down at her lemonade, watched her do the small internal work of deciding that she would survive this moment too, the way she had survived all the others. There was something in that stillness that hit him somewhere behind his ribs, in a place he had been careful to keep unoccupied. He didn't make a decision exactly. It was more like his feet made it for him. He crossed the room. He crossed it in full view of everyone, slowly enough that heads turned, quickly enough that there was purpose in every step. He crossed it, and he stopped in front of Willow Marsh, and she looked up from her lemonade with eyes that held the remnants of pain and the arrival of bewilderment. And Alaric Pendergast, the Duke of Pendergast, man of 6 years studied indifference to every woman in England, dropped to one knee and lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with the deliberate, unhurried reverence of a man who means every syllable of a gesture. The room went silent. He held the kiss for a moment, long enough to be unmistakable, short enough to be gentlemanly, and then rose and kept her hand in his and looked at her with an expression that he only later understood was the first genuinely unguarded thing he'd shown in public in 6 years. Her face was extraordinary. Not because it was composed. It wasn't, not entirely. There was still the shadow of Arabella's words on it. But underneath, rising the way light rises after a cloud passes, was something else. A confusion that was not unpleasant. A fragile wondering. And beneath all of it, a warmth that she had not had time to hide. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear, I hope you'll do me the honor of the next dance, Miss Marsh. And Willow Marsh, who had been nobody's first choice for 23 years, said yes. They danced. It was a country set, not the intimate configuration of a waltz, which was perhaps fortunate, because neither of them was ready for that yet. They moved through the patterns of the dance with the choreographed proximity of a form that allows conversation without demanding it. And for the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Willow was processing. Her mind was running the evening backward and forward simultaneously. The words, the silence, the crossing of the room, the knee, the hand, trying to find the explanation that made logical sense and failing to locate one. She was not naive. She understood that gestures in ballrooms carried messages, that a duke crossing a room was a legible text that every person present was already reading and interpreting. She understood that by morning this would be talked about in 30 different drawing rooms. She understood, with the careful practical intelligence she had spent years developing as a kind of survival tool, that there were 100 reasons a man might do what he had done, some of them genuinely kind, some of them not. She had learned to be careful with hope. And then he said, guiding her through a turn, "Your sister is very practiced at that." She looked at him. He was watching the middle distance with an expression of mild interest that she read, after a moment, as very deliberate restraint, the face of a man who has opinions he is choosing to deliver carefully. She said, "She has had a great deal of time to perfect it." Something in his face shifted. "Not much, just a degree." "How long has she been doing it?" "Since I was old enough to be compared to. A beat. I try not to keep a running count. It becomes dispiriting." He looked at her then, directly, the way people rarely looked at her. And she felt the attention of it land somewhere physical, like a hand placed on a shoulder. "Does it work?" he asked, trying not to count. She almost said yes, reflexively, because she was a practiced composer of palatable answers, but something about the directness of him, the way he had asked it without ceremony or softness, as though he expected a real response, made her pause. "Not particularly," she admitted. He smiled. Not the pleasant social smile she'd already noticed him deploy 6 or 7 times across the room that evening. Something different, smaller, more located in the eyes than the mouth. "No, I didn't think it would." They separated for a figure and came back together, and she was aware of a very strange sensation, the feeling of being looked at by someone who was not comparing her to anything. Just looking. Just her. She did not know what to do with it, so she said, with a lightness she had assembled from somewhere, "You have caused something of a stir, Your Grace." "Have I?" Not a question. 300 people are currently constructing narratives about your motivations. I expect by morning at least 6 of them will be engaged. "Only 6? He sounded genuinely amused. "I must be losing my touch." "I give it 6 families," she clarified. "The individual count will be considerably higher." The amusement deepened. "And what narrative are you constructing, Miss Marsh?" She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly regulated. "I haven't decided yet. I'm waiting for more data. A scientist. An observer. Is there a difference?" She thought about it. The scientist expects to find something. The observer tries to have no expectations at all. He was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Which is easier?" "Neither," she said honestly. "Having no expectations is very difficult when you want things. What do you want?" The question arrived simply, without the performance of flirtation. It was the question of someone genuinely curious, and it disarmed her so completely that she answered before her caution could intercept it. "To be known," she said. "Not seen. Known. There's a difference." He didn't respond immediately. She felt the pause as something weighted, something he was sitting with rather than rushing past. "Yes," he said finally. "There is." The dance ended. He returned her to the edge of the room with a correctness of manner that was somehow also warm. She did not have the vocabulary for it yet, this warmth that lived inside his propriety, and bowed over her hand again, and said, plainly, that he hoped to see her at the Harrington musical on Thursday. She said she would be there. And then she stood very still and watched him walk away, and thought, with a clarity that both thrilled and frightened her, "Oh, this is going to be complicated." She was not wrong. The morning after the ball, 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, Mrs. Marsh, over breakfast, delivered a speech of such elaborate tactical optimism that Willow needed a second cup of tea just to follow it, the thrust of which was that the Duke of Pendergast was clearly interested, that this was a remarkable and transformative opportunity, and that Willow must not, under any circumstances, do anything to discourage him. This last part was delivered with an undertone of concern that suggested Mrs. Marsh was not entirely certain of Willow's capacity to handle the assignment. Second, Arabella said nothing at breakfast. She ate her eggs with a precision and stillness that Willow recognized immediately. The stillness of someone who is thinking very fast and very hard under a surface of perfect composure. Third, a card arrived from the Duke of Pendergast, addressed to Miss Willow Marsh, expressing his hope that she had enjoyed the previous evening, and his anticipation of the Harrington musical. Mrs. Marsh held the card, and then pressed it briefly to her chest. Arabella's fork made a small sound against her plate. Willow drank her tea, and tried not to feel the thing that was building in her ribcage, like the first measures of a song you don't yet know the words to. The Harrington musicale was on Thursday the 17th of April, at a house in Grosvenor Square that was better suited to intimate gatherings, which meant 50 people rather than 300, and considerably fewer places to disappear. He was already there when the Marsh family arrived, standing near the pianoforte, talking to Lord Allenby about something that had made them both laugh. And he looked up when she entered the room with the focused immediacy of someone who had been watching the door. She noticed this. She filed it away. He made his way to her within 5 minutes, which was quick enough to mean something, and they spent the first half of the musical seated 3 chairs apart, close enough for occasional exchange, properly separated enough for decorum, trading quiet commentary on the performances in the low murmur that is the true art form of any musical audience. He was, she discovered, funny, not in the performed way of men who want to be thought witty, in the observational, self-aware way that suggested he found the world genuinely ridiculous and was willing to admit it. When the second violinist missed an entrance by a full measure, he did not laugh. He simply leaned incrementally in her direction and said, at a volume just below audible, he was perfectly on time. Everyone else was simply confused. She pressed her lips together very hard. He kept his expression immaculate. During the interval, when people rose to collect refreshments and find new conversation partners, he appeared at her side and they walked to the window and stood in the particular configuration that signals private conversation without requiring any announcement of it. "You grew up in Wiltshire?" he asked. She said yes. Briarwood, their estate, near Marlborough. She had the habit, when asked about home, of keeping her answers contained. She had learned that most people asked the question as social maintenance and were not interested in the actual answer. But he followed up, specifically, asking about the landscape, about what she'd done with her time there, about whether she rode. She told him about the downs, the great open sweeps of chalk grassland, where the sky was 3 times the size of itself, with an involuntary animation she recognized, with some embarrassment, as the voice she used when she forgot to perform indifference. She told him about her horse, a grey mare named Solstice, who had been retired to pasture 2 years ago, and was, as far as Willow was concerned, the finest creature in Wiltshire. She told him about the book she'd been reading during the journey to London, a novel she'd ordered from a bookseller on the basis of a review she'd found in a 3-month-old magazine, which had turned out to be entirely worth the speculation. He listened. Not politely. Actually, she could tell the difference now. Polite listening has a quality of managed patience. Actual listening is quieter. It changes the texture of the silence between sentences. He had been born in London, he told her in exchange, but his family's principal seat was in Yorkshire, and he missed it in ways that he found difficult to explain to people who had never spent time in a landscape that felt, he paused, choosing the word, serious. She knew immediately what he meant by that. The downs had the same quality. a grandeur that was not decorative, that did not care whether you found it beautiful or not. They were interrupted, gently, inevitably, when Mrs. Marsh materialized with the timing of a woman who had been watching from 12 feet away for the last 20 minutes and had waited as long as her nerves permitted. She inserted herself into the conversation with a warmth so concentrated it was almost its own weather system. And Willow watched Alaric deploy the pleasant but absent social courtesy with practiced ease, and felt a small, complicated thing. Not jealousy exactly, but a kind of longing for the uninterrupted version. For the conversation before the interruption, he caught her eye once, briefly, in the middle of her mother's monologue about the Wiltshire countryside. A glance of shared recognition that lasted half a second and said, without words, I know. I'm still here. They saw each other 4 more times in the following 2 weeks, at a dinner at Lord and Lady Fenwick's, where they were seated across the table from each other and conducted an entire secondary conversation through a careful exchange of expressions, while the primary conversation swirled around them. At an afternoon exhibition of watercolours at the house of a Lady Cromwell, where Alaric appeared without having mentioned he would be there, and found her in front of a small painting of a coast in winter that she had been standing before for 10 minutes, and stood beside her. And they discussed it in the low, earnest way that 2 people discuss a piece of art when they have stopped performing appreciation and started having it. At a picnic in Hyde Park, organised by Lady Cecily Vance, which was too public and too structured for the kind of conversation they had begun to have with each other, but where he found a way to walk beside her for half of it, and they talked about nothing in particular with the ease of people who have discovered that talking about nothing in particular is, sometimes, the most intimate thing. And at an evening card party at the Clarendon townhouse, where they did not speak much at all. He was occupied at whist, she at the periphery of a different table. But where she looked up at one point and found him looking at her across the room with an expression she could not fully decode, and something in her chest made a decision she hadn't been asked about. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know the weather is changing before it changes. A shift in pressure, a quality in the air. She knew it as a fact before she was ready to let it be a fact, and she filed it away with the careful organization of someone who has been hurt enough times that they manage their own feelings the way you manage a fire. Keep it controlled, keep it contained, don't let it get ahead of you. She did not tell him. She did not tell anyone. She was not yet certain he wanted her to. Arabella had been watching. She had been watching since the ball, with an attention that she had learned, over years, to render invisible. She was very good at appearing not to care about the things she cared about most. It was a skill she had developed as self-protection and wielded as strategy. And she deployed it now with the quiet efficiency of someone running a campaign they cannot afford to lose. She wanted the Duke of Pendergast. She had wanted him since the autumn of 1805, when she had first seen him at Lady Melbourne's, and understood, with the instantaneous calculation of a woman who had been trained from birth to read rooms and rank prospects, that he was the highest value target in the field. She had spent the better part of 2 years attempting to get within range of him, and he had been, not unkind, she would grant him that, but thoroughly, cheerfully, impenetrably uninterested, and now he was interested in Willow. This was not, to Arabella's mind, a possible reality. It was a temporary aberration, a gallant impulse that had gotten out of hand. Willow was her little sister, unremarkable, bookish, the kind of quiet that people mistook for depth. Men like Alaric Pendergast did not fall for women like Willow Marsh. They appreciated women who understood the game, women who could match them. She was, she told herself, doing Willow a kindness, protecting her from the inevitable disappointment of a duke who would lose interest within a month. She told herself this often enough that she almost believed it. The first thing she did was small, a remark here, a tilted observation there. At the Fenwick dinner, when her mother expressed excitement about the Duke's attention to Willow, Arabella noted, gently, that he was known for brief enthusiasms. At the Clarendon card party, in conversation with Lady Harcourt, who was connected to approximately everyone, she mentioned, with concern in her voice, that she worried Willow had taken the season's early interest rather too seriously. She's always been a little naive about these things. I do hope no one allows her to make a fool of herself. Lady Harcourt mentioned it to her cousin. Her cousin mentioned it to her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law had tea with Mrs. Aldermot, who had tea with half of Mayfair. The second thing Arabella did was more direct. She began to be wherever Alaric was. Not aggressively. She was too skilled for aggression. Softly, with the drift of someone who simply moves through the same spaces by coincidence. She laughed more brightly when he was nearby. She wore her best colours. She positioned herself in sight lines. And then, on the 28th of April, at the Viscount Ashby's evening assembly, she did the third thing. She arranged to be alone with him in the library. It was not difficult. It required only a whispered word to a mutual acquaintance about a book she had been seeking, a note sent through a footman that had been perhaps not entirely honest about its origin, and excellent timing. She was there when he arrived, standing by the shelves with a candle, and an expression of artless surprise that she had rehearsed until it looked like it hadn't been rehearsed at all. He looked at her, and then around the empty room, and then back at her, with the expression of a man who has been in enough drawing rooms to know the architecture of an ambush. Miss Marsh. Perfectly even. She began to speak. She said things she had prepared, careful things, with just enough honesty threaded through the strategy to make the whole structure feel genuine. She said she had been wanting to speak to him about Willow. She said it with concern. She said that she hoped he understood the position he had put her sister in, that Willow was tender, that she formed attachments easily, that she had been hurt before by gentlemen who did not intend what she had taken from their attentions. She said she would feel terrible if Willow were to suffer again. All of this was delivered with the soft, regretful manner of a devoted elder sister, and then, tilting her head just slightly, with the candlelight doing what candlelight does, she added, "I know you are not a man who intends cruelty, Your Grace, but I wonder if you have considered, entirely, what you are doing." There was a silence. Alaric looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she could not read. And Arabella was good at reading expressions. His face was doing something she did not have a category for. It was not charmed. It was not annoyed. It was attentive, in a way that felt more like being assessed than admired. He said, "I appreciate your concern, Miss Marsh." A pause, and then, with a quietness that was somehow final, "I wonder if you might consider what you are doing." She blinked. He did not elaborate. He simply inclined his head with perfect courtesy and left the library. And Arabella stood by the bookshelf with the candle and the unpleasant sensation of a woman who has played a card with confidence and found that the other person's hand is better. He found Willow 20 minutes later in the assembly room, near the far wall, because he had learned by now to look near the walls. She was talking to a young woman he didn't know, talking in the real way, leaning slightly forward, genuinely engaged. She was laughing at something. He stopped several feet away and watched for a moment, because the sight of her laughing, actually laughing, not the performed version, was something he had decided somewhere in the past 3 weeks to look for, and then couldn't stop looking for. When she saw him, the laughter didn't stop. It just redirected. She finished what she was saying to her companion and turned to him with an openness that consistently surprised him. She was not coy with him. She had never been coy. She gave him her actual face, and he did not know entirely what to do with a gift that size, but he was increasingly certain he did not want to give it back. He said, as they found their way to the edge of the room, "I should tell you something. There was an incident earlier this evening, in the library. Your sister arranged to be alone with me there." He said it without drama, without the heightened cadence of a man delivering a scandal. He said it the way he had begun, in the past weeks, to tell her things, plainly, because she deserved the plain version. She expressed concern for you. It was very carefully constructed. I told her I appreciated her concern, and I asked her to consider what she was doing. A pause. "I didn't tell you at the time because I didn't want to put you in the middle of something that was still unresolved. I realize now that was the wrong call. You deserve to know, and I'm telling you now because I would rather be honest with you late than careful with you indefinitely." She looked at him for a moment. "She's afraid," Willow said, "of being irrelevant, of disappearing." It was not a defense, exactly. More like a translation. "I know," he said quietly. "That doesn't make what she did right." "No, it doesn't." She was quiet a moment. "Thank you for telling me," he said, as they settled into the familiar rhythm of their conversation. "Tell me something true." She looked at him sideways. They had developed, over the past weeks, a small vocabulary of games, ways of getting to honest conversation through the side door when the front door felt too exposed. This was one of them. "I think very good bread," she said, "is one of the most underrated pleasures in the world, and I am suspicious of people who are indifferent to it." He did not smile. He said, "True, something true about yourself." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. "I am frightened," she said eventually, in a voice that was very steady, which was, he understood, not the absence of fear, but the discipline of it, of wanting something I can't keep. "I have wanted things before and lost them or been told I was wrong to want them, and I have gotten quite good at not wanting too visibly. But I think—" She stopped. "What do you think?" "I think I may be losing that particular skill." He turned to look at her fully then, and she looked back, and something passed between them that had been accumulating for 3 weeks and had reached a weight that neither of them could continue to pretend was light. "Good," he said quietly, and she heard, underneath the single syllable, everything he had not yet said. The counterpart to her own admission. The equivalent confession from someone who had spent 6 years being very good at not wanting, and was beginning to be undone by her. May arrived, and with it the thicker social calendar of the mid-season, and the problem of Arabella escalated from background concern to active complication. Willow had noticed. She was an observer. She had always been an observer. And she noticed the pattern of her sister's positioning, the way certain whispers seemed to originate from a single source, the way women who had been perfectly cordial to her would sometimes hold back a degree, and she could feel, without being able to prove it, the hand behind the distance. She did not say anything. She was still, at her core, a woman who had been trained by years of family dynamics to absorb and endure and not create difficulty. She processed what she noticed privately, and kept her counsel, and watched. And then came Lady Pemberton's garden party on the 15th of May. The garden was extraordinary. The kind of space that London produces with specific intent, designed to feel like countryside dropped inside the city. There were roses that had been coaxed into early bloom by some horticultural ambition or greenhouse intervention, and long walks between hedged corridors that offered the illusion of privacy while being, in fact, visible from the terrace. Willow had gone down one of these walks alone, not from design, just from the habit of needing, occasionally, a few minutes without the weight of social performance, when she heard voices. Arabella and Lady Harcourt. They were on the other side of the hedge, not visible, their voices carrying with the particular clarity that stone and greenery sometimes produce. What she heard. Arabella, in the tone of gentle regret she had been deploying for weeks, telling Lady Harcourt that she had it on good authority that the Duke of Pendergast had been paying Willow attention primarily out of charity, that he had been embarrassed by the remark at the ball and felt a gentlemanly obligation to counteract it, and that anyone who expected his interest to progress beyond basic politeness was, unfortunately, reading more into the situation than was there. Willow stood on the other side of the hedge and breathed. She breathed through the first wave of it, which was hot and terrible and very old. The familiar pain of being seen as a charity case, as the recipient of pity, as someone whose value was so low that even kindness directed at her had to be reframed as obligation rather than genuine feeling. She breathed through the second wave, which was about Alaric, about the possibility that Arabella was right, that she had allowed herself to construct meaning from gestures that were only courtesy, that she had been, as Mr. Fenton's letter had suggested 2 years ago, too earnest, too sincere, had projected substance onto something thin. And then she breathed through the third wave, which was different from the other two, quieter and colder and more resolved. It was the wave that asked, with the precision of a woman who has spent years developing her observational intelligence, "Is this true?" And the answer that came back was, "I don't know. But I am going to find out, instead of simply believing the person who benefits most from my believing it." This was new. This was something Willow Marsh at 20 or 21 or even 22 would not have had ready access to. She had grown quietly and without fanfare, while everyone around her was looking at Arabella. She walked back to the party. Alaric found her by the roses and saw in her face that something had happened. He did not ask immediately. He stood beside her and let her set the pace, which was a thing she had come to rely on. His patience, the way he did not require her to perform fine when she wasn't. "I overheard my sister," she said, after a moment, a pause. "The library, I take it, was not the first attempt." She turned to look at him. "You knew." "I knew the library was not accidental." He said it without heat. "I did not know the full shape of it, but I recognized the intention." "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't want to create—" He stopped, and she watched him choose his words with unusual care. "I didn't want to make a battlefield of your family. It wasn't my place." She considered this. It was an answer she could find fault with, and a part of her wanted to, because she was angry and he was close, and the two things were in proximity. But the honest part of her, the observational part, knew that the answer contained something genuine, something careful, something that was trying to protect her even in its imperfection. "She says you are doing this out of obligation," Willow said plainly, "that the ball was a charitable impulse and what's followed is courtesy." He looked at her for a long moment. She met it. "Is that what it feels like?" he asked. She thought about everything. The music hall, the watercolor exhibition, the conversations that had gone places conversations in drawing rooms were not supposed to go. His face when she laughed. His face when she had said, "I think I may be losing that particular skill." "No," she said quietly, "but I have been wrong before about what things mean." "As have I." He turned slightly toward her. "So I will tell you plainly, which is something I have not been, historically, in the habit of." A breath. "What I feel toward you is not obligation. It is not courtesy. It is not the aftermath of an embarrassing moment that I am attempting to manage by compensating you with attention." He paused, and she thought she could see the effort it cost him. This man who had spent 6 years being careful not to want things, dismantling his own carefulness in real time. "I am not accustomed to this. To wanting to be somewhere rather than successfully inhabiting it. To looking for someone in a room and finding that the room is only interesting once I have found them." He stopped. "I realize that is perhaps more than you asked for." "No," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "It is exactly what I asked for." The roses were doing something absurd and romantic around them, the way garden roses do in May, when they have no respect for the dignity of the people standing in them. And Willow Marsh, who had been teaching herself not to hope for years, allowed herself to hope. The confrontation with Arabella happened 2 days later, on the 17th of May. Not in a ballroom or a garden or anywhere that could be called dramatic, but in the morning room of the Marsh family's rented townhouse, over cold tea and the remains of breakfast. Willow had thought about how to approach it for 2 days and had decided, ultimately, that there was no elegant approach. There was only honesty, and she had been building toward honesty her entire life. She said, quietly and directly, that she knew what Arabella had been doing. She named it, the remarks to Lady Harcourt, the library at Ashby's Assembly, the deliberate construction of a narrative designed to undermine what was between Willow and Alaric. Arabella, to her credit, did not immediately deny it. She sat very still, the way she had at the breakfast table after the ball, with the controlled stillness of someone who is recalibrating. Then she said, and there was something underneath her voice that Willow had not heard in years, something that was almost genuine, that she had only been trying to protect her, that Willow didn't understand men like Alaric Pendergast, that she would end up heartbroken, and Arabella had been trying to prevent it. Willow listened to all of it. She listened the way she had learned to listen, completely, without performing reaction. And then she said, gently and without cruelty, "You wanted him. Before I was in the picture, you wanted him. And that is, I am not going to tell you that you cannot feel what you feel." A pause. "But I am going to tell you that what you have been doing is not protection. You know that. I think, underneath everything, you know that." Arabella said nothing. "I am not angry," Willow continued. And the surprising thing was that it was true. Not because she was saintly, but because understanding a thing takes the heat out of it. "I am sad. Because we have never been. We have never been what sisters could be. And I don't know entirely whose fault that is, or if fault is even the right word. But I would like—" She stopped and felt the fragility of what she was about to say, and said it anyway. "I would like for that to change. If you would." Arabella looked at her for a long time. Whatever she found in Willow's face, the directness, the lack of performance, the genuine open hand being offered, did something to her that she was not prepared for. Her composure cracked, not catastrophically, but at the edges, the way ice cracks before it shifts. She said, low and almost inaudible, "I have always been so afraid of ending up overlooked, irrelevant. I watched you watching everything, and I thought if I didn't push harder, if I didn't take up more space, you would disappear," Willow said softly. Arabella pressed her lips together, nodded. "I know what that feels like," Willow said. "I have known it for 23 years, and I chose someone who saw me anyway. I would rather you had someone who sees you, actually you, not the performance, than spend the rest of your life running the performance for an audience that would have loved you without it." It was not a fixed thing, that conversation. It was the beginning of something that would take months and honesty and probably several more difficult mornings to grow into. But it was a start, and Willow had learned to value starts. Their father appeared in the doorway sometime in the middle of it, not because he had been listening, but because Mr. Edmund Marsh had a gift for arriving in rooms at precisely the wrong moment, and then standing there with the mild, faintly apologetic air of a man who has spent 30 years being the quietest person in his own house. He looked at both his daughters, at Arabella's fractured composure, at Willow's steady hands around her cold tea, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, "I owe you both an apology, I think, for letting things become what they became." He paused. "I was never very good at intervening. Your mother is better at the world than I am. I let her lead, and told myself that was wisdom." He looked at Willow specifically, with an expression she had not seen on his face before, clear-eyed, regretful, and entirely present. "It wasn't wisdom. It was cowardice. I am sorry, Willow." It was not a long speech. He was not a man built for long speeches. He nodded once, as though he had discharged a debt he had been carrying for some years, and retreated back into the hallway. Arabella stared after him. Willow looked down at her tea. "Well," Arabella said, after a moment, in a voice that was trying very hard not to crack, "I suppose we are all learning something today." "Apparently," said Willow, and despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, she smiled. On the 22nd of May, Alaric Pendergast called on Miss Willow Marsh at the townhouse in Brook Street with the stated intention of asking her to ride in the park, and the actual intention of something larger that he had been, for the better part of a week, preparing for, and then deciding he was not ready for, and then deciding he was. The ride happened, Rotten Row in the morning, quiet enough at that hour that they had the relative privacy of people who are technically in public but not currently under full surveillance. He had arranged for a groom at enough distance for propriety and not enough for eavesdropping. He told her about his parents. He did not do it dramatically. He did it the way he was beginning to learn to do things with her, plainly, without performing either pain or indifference. He told her about his father's cold distance and his mother's contained loneliness, and the thing he had observed as a child, and then carried forward into adulthood, as a kind of governing fear. That marriage was a trap, a beautiful box that looked like something else until you were inside it. She listened without interrupting. Her horse walked steadily beside his, and she said nothing until he was done. And then she said, "That must have been very lonely to grow up in." Not all marriages are like that. Not. I would be different. Not the reassurance he had been, in some small part, prepared to deflect. Just that. The simple, accurate naming of what it had been. He felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was clenched. "Yes," he said. "And it made you decide," she continued, "that wanting something like that, a real life with someone, was too dangerous. That the cost of being wrong was too high." Yes. And now? He was quiet for a moment, looking ahead between his horse's ears at the long path through the park, the green and the light, the city going about itself at a distance. "Now," he said, "I am more afraid of the alternative." She looked at him. "I am more afraid," he said, more quietly, "of a life in which I never tried, in which I stayed comfortable and alone and watched other people from the correct distance and never—" He stopped. And in the stopping she heard everything the sentence would have said. Never knew her, never stopped managing the distance, never let the fire have any real air. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it. Are you about to say what I think you're about to say?" Something shifted in his face. The full, unguarded thing. The one she'd first seen in the ballroom when he'd risen from his knee and looked at her. "That depends entirely on what you think I'm about to say." She held his gaze. "That you love me." A pause that contained a great deal. "Yes," he said simply. "That is what I was about to say." Her horse tossed its head slightly, as though aware of the moment and registering approval. And Willow laughed, the real laugh, the slow arrival, and then all at once one, the one he had been collecting, and said, "Good, because I love you too." And I was starting to wonder if I was going to have to say it first. He proposed on the 29th of May, 1807, in the garden of Lord and Lady Fenwick's townhouse, during a dinner party that they had both been attending and had both, separately and then in silent coordination, stepped away from. There was no elaborate preparation, no grand setting. He had considered grand settings and rejected them because he understood, by now, that Willow's primary language was not spectacle. Her language was honesty and simplicity, and the real thing over the performed thing, every time. He had a ring, his grandmother's, an oval sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, chosen because the grandmother had been the only person in his family's history who had clearly married for love and been happy about it. He had had it resized and brought it in his jacket pocket to 3 different events before finding the right moment. And the right moment turned out to be a garden in May with the sound of a dinner party drifting through the French doors and the smell of night-flowering jasmine that had been convinced by a warm spell to open early. He said what he felt. He did not dress it in the formality of a speech because he had realized, somewhere in the past months, that formal speeches are for people who are performing a feeling, and he was not performing. He said he had spent a long time keeping the world at exactly the right distance to prevent himself from wanting anything too much, and that she had dismantled that distance so thoroughly and so gently that he hadn't noticed it happening until he was standing fully in his own life for the first time in 6 years. And he wanted, with a clarity he had not thought himself capable of, to spend the rest of it with her. He said he knew it would not be simple, that he had a family history to make peace with and a reputation to correct and a way of being in the world that he was still, actively, learning to expand. He said he would not promise perfection. He said he would promise to keep talking to her, to keep asking what she wanted, to keep being the person who looked for her in rooms and found that the room was better once he had. He said, "I love you, marry me." Willow Marsh, who had spent 23 years invisible, looked at him for a long moment in the jasmine-scented dark and felt the whole accumulated weight of her life. The walls, the windows, the second cups of tea, the walking slightly behind, lift. She said yes. She said it plainly and completely, and without qualifying it. without the cautious hedging of a woman who has been careful with hope for too long. She said it like someone who has decided that the fire can have air. He put the ring on her finger. It fit as though it had been waiting. He kissed her then, finally, properly, with the unhurried intention of a man who has stopped running from things. And she kissed him back with the openness that was, and always had been, the most remarkable thing about her. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post on the 4th of June, 1807. London received it with the full theatrical astonishment of a city that had been expecting it for 3 weeks. Lady Harcourt called it inevitable. Lord Hailey, who had been watching the whole business from the card-room with considerable admiration, told anyone who would listen that he had seen it coming since April. Mrs. Marsh wept with a relief and happiness so combined that she could not separate them and did not try. Arabella attended the small celebratory dinner the family held the following week and sat across from Willow and said, without fanfare, that she was glad. It was not effusive. It was not replete with sisterly warmth. But it was true, and between the two of them, true had always been more valuable than warm. She returned to London the following season, the season of 1808, with something that had not been there before. A quietness underneath the performance, not less beautiful, not less composed, but somehow less armoured, as though she had decided, after a long consideration, to try a different strategy altogether. It was at a small dinner in February of that year that she was seated beside a Mr. Daniel Ashford, second son of an earl, no title to speak of, a man who had made his own modest fortune in a way that polite society found slightly unconventional, and Arabella found, to her own surprise, rather interesting. He talked to her about things she did not expect to be talked to about. He was not dazzled by her. He was curious about her, which was different, and which she did not quite know what to do with, and which she thought about for several days afterwards. It was a beginning. Whether it became more than that is another story, and one she was only just learning how to tell. Alaric, watching the two sisters across the dinner table, leaned close to Willow and said quietly, "This is the beginning, I think." She looked at him. Of what? He thought about it. Everything. All of it. The part where we stop running our respective systems of avoidance and just live. She considered this. That sounds terrifying. Yes, he agreed. It absolutely does. They were married in August, at the church in the village nearest the Pendergast estate in Yorkshire, where the sky was exactly as serious as he had described, and the moors in August have a wildness to them that the south of England never quite manages. She wore white with gold thread that caught the light when she moved, and she looked, for the first time in her adult life, like a woman who had been dressed by someone who saw her. She had dressed herself, which may have been the point. He stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him and felt something so large and so simple that he had no language for it, just the fact of her, coming toward him in the serious northern light, choosing him, being chosen, the two of them stepping together into the terrifying and wonderful business of living. Outside, the Yorkshire wind moved through the churchyard grass with its characteristic indifference to occasion, and the sky was the 3 times usual size she had once told him about. And Willow Marsh, Willow Pendergast now, Duchess of Pendergast, though she would always think of herself in the hyphen between the two names, in the space of becoming, arrived at the altar and looked up at him and smiled. Not the careful smile, not the assembled from somewhere smile, the real one, slow to arrive, all at once. He had been collecting it for months. He thought he might spend the rest of his life collecting it. He thought, and this was the thing he would remember, years later, as the moment he understood what his life was going to be, that he could not imagine a better use of a life. She had been invisible her entire life. And then someone looked, and kept looking. And that, as it turns out, is all anyone ever needed. If this story moved you, subscribe for more. Drop a comment. Which moment hit you the hardest? The knee at the ball, or the proposal in the jasmine garden?